Claire Reed had always believed in fresh starts. After a messy divorce and years of struggling to put herself first, she finally decided to carve out a new life for herself. One where she could have complete control over her space, her peace, and most importantly, her health. Living with type 1 diabetes had never been easy, but she had always been meticulous, responsible, and prepared. Her insulin pump was a lifeline, a piece of medical technology that she had come to rely on, not just as a convenience but as a necessity. The thought of something happening to it had never crossed her mind, because why would it? She had always lived in safe neighborhoods, had always taken every precaution, and had never been in a situation where someone might deliberately take something that kept her alive. But she had never lived in a place like this before. The house had seemed perfect at first, quaint, quiet, in a well-maintained neighborhood with neatly trimmed lawns and a community that, at least on the surface, appeared welcoming. The move had been exhausting, but the sense of relief she felt when she finally put down her last box and looked around at her new home was immeasurable. This was hers. No one could take it away from her. No one could dictate how she lived her life. She had barely finished unpacking when she met Karen Mills, the self-proclaimed enforcer of community order, a woman who exuded authority despite having no real power beyond the rules she had assigned herself. Claire had heard of people like her overbearing, obsessed with control, unable to function unless they were micromanaging the lives of those around them. She had smiled politely, introduced herself, and hoped that would be enough to establish a civil, if distant, neighborly relationship. It wasn't. Karen had made it clear from the very beginning that she did not appreciate changes in the neighborhood. Claire, with her medical devices and her independent attitude, was an anomaly, an inconvenience to Karen's perfectly curated suburban fantasy. It had started with comments passive-aggressive at first, then progressively more pointed. "We like to keep things uniform around here," she had said on their second meeting, eyeing Claire's medical refrigerator through the window. It would be a shame if the neighborhood started looking like a hospital. Claire had ignored it. She had spent too many years in her past relationship being made to feel like a burden, like her existence was something that needed to be adjusted or hidden to make others comfortable. She wasn't going to let some nosy suburban dictator make her feel that way now. She had simply nodded, said nothing, and gone back inside. The problem with people like Karen was that they mistook silence for submission. The first real issue arose when Claire received a letter, an official-looking document with a complaint about unauthorized exterior modifications. The modification in question? The small cooler she had placed on her back porch containing her insulin supply. It wasn't permanent, it wasn't disruptive, and it certainly wasn't an eyesore. Yet here was an official notice demanding that she remove it immediately or face a fine. Claire had debated responding, explaining, trying to reason with whoever was responsible, but something told her that wouldn't matter. She removed the cooler, moved her supplies inside, and convinced herself it wasn't worth making a fuss over. Then came the missing packages. The first time it happened, she thought it was a simple mistake. A delivery notification had popped up on her phone, stating that her package had been left at her front door, but when she went to retrieve it, it was gone. It was just some household items, nothing valuable, nothing irreplaceable, so she filed a report with the courier and tried to put it out of her mind. The second time, it was something more important, replacement medical supplies that, while not immediately necessary, were expensive and required a doctor's approval to reorder. When she mentioned it to one of her neighbors, they gave her a look she didn't quite understand. "Karen's real particular about what gets left out," they said hesitantly before quickly changing the subject. Claire had started to keep a closer eye on her deliveries after that, tracking them down the minute they arrived. It was inconvenient, but not unmanageable. She didn't want to assume Karen was behind it, but the thought had started to take root. Something about the way she watched Claire, the way she always seemed to know what was happening on her property, the way she was always there when Claire received a delivery, made her stomach tighten. Then, one afternoon, her worst nightmare happened. Her new insulin pump had arrived, an advanced, state-of-the-art model that had cost her thousands of dollars, It partially covered by insurance, but still an investment she couldn't afford to lose. It was a game changer, designed to make managing her diabetes easier, more efficient, safer. She had been tracking the shipment obsessively, knowing that missing it would mean jumping through an infuriating amount of bureaucratic hoops to get it replaced. The moment she got the notification, she stepped outside, but the package was already gone. Panic set in immediately. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This wasn't a missing book or a misplaced order of vitamins. This was something she needed to live, something she couldn't afford to have stolen or lost in transit. She looked around, trying to see if a neighbor had taken it in for safekeeping, but there was no one in sight. And then, as if on cue, Karen appeared. She was standing on the sidewalk, watching her, arms crossed over her chest, an expression of something close to amusement on her face. Claire's heart pounded as she took a step forward, trying to keep her voice level. "Did you see a package here?" she asked. Karen tilted her head slightly, as if considering her words carefully before responding. "You mean the box with all the medical junk?" Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. "Yes, that box." Karen smiled, slow and deliberate, before shrugging. "I took care of it." The words didn't make sense at first. Took care of it? Like she had moved it somewhere, held onto it for safekeeping. But the way Karen's expression didn't waver, the way her eyes gleamed with something smug and satisfied, told Claire everything she needed to know. Her stomach dropped. "Give it back." Karen laughed, actually laughed, as if Claire had just told the funniest joke she had ever heard. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "You don't need it. That stuff is just a crutch. People like you rely too much on all these fancy gadgets instead of just taking care of themselves the way nature intended. Maybe if you watched what you ate, exercised a little more, you wouldn't need to be hooked up to machines all the time." Claire could barely process what she was hearing. Her head was spinning, her pulse racing. This woman, this absolute lunatic, had taken something vital, something that was not hers to take, and was now standing there, smugly justifying it, as if she had done Claire a favor. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Where is it?" she demanded. Karen shrugged. "Gone. Gone." Claire didn't hesitate. She turned on her heel, pulled out her phone, and dialed the police. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let Karen win. Claire's hands were shaking as she held her phone to her ear, listening to the mechanical voice on the other end instructing her to stay on the line. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, every ring of the dispatch line grinding against her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. She had never been the kind of person to involve the police in anything unless absolutely necessary. She didn't like confrontation, didn't enjoy stirring up trouble, and had spent most of her life avoiding unnecessary conflicts. But this was not something she could ignore. This wasn't about a neighborhood dispute or an overbearing woman who had too much time on her hands. This was about survival. This was about someone deliberately stealing something that kept her alive, and if she didn't do something about it now, she didn't know what Karen might do next. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost detached, as if they had already decided this was going to be just another minor incident, just another neighborly squabble over a missing package. Claire forced herself to take a breath, steadying her voice as best she could. "My medical equipment was stolen," she said, trying to keep the sheer panic out of her tone. "I need an officer here now." The dispatcher asked her to clarify, and she explained as succinctly as she could that her insulin pump, an expensive, essential piece of medical technology, had been delivered to her home, only to be taken by her neighbor, who had openly admitted to removing it. She gave Karen's name, her address, and emphasized, over and over again, that this wasn't just about stolen property. It was a direct threat to her health. "I understand, the dispatcher said in a carefully neutral tone. "An officer will be dispatched to your location shortly." Shortly. Claire wasn't sure what that meant in practical terms. She had lived in places where shortly meant 10 minutes, and she had lived in places where it meant 2 hours. The uncertainty made her skin crawl. She turned back toward Karen, who was still standing on the sidewalk, watching her with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed, without a doubt, that nothing would happen to her. "What did you do with it?" Claire asked again, lowering her phone only slightly. Karen smirked. "Oh, come on now, sweetheart. Don't be so dramatic." Dramatic. The word nearly made Claire's blood boil. She had spent years of her life being accused of overreacting, of making things into a bigger deal than they needed to be. She had been called hysterical by doctors when she tried to explain that her symptoms weren't just in her head, that her body was failing her, that she wasn't just stressed or anxious or not taking care of herself properly. She had fought too hard to be taken seriously, had spent too much time proving that her illness wasn't some exaggeration, to let someone like Karen dismiss her now. "Where is it?" Claire repeated, enunciating every word with barely restrained fury. Karen shrugged, feigning innocence. "I threw it away." Claire's stomach lurched. The casual cruelty of it, the sheer nonchalance with which Karen admitted to disposing of something that wasn't just expensive, but necessary for Claire's survival, sent a bolt of pure, unfiltered rage through her. She had known deep down that Karen had done something awful, but hearing her say it aloud, as if it were nothing, as if Claire's health, her life meant nothing, was something else entirely. "You're lying," Claire said, voice shaking with barely contained fury. Karen just smiled, that infuriating, saccharine expression that made Claire's hands itch to wipe it off her face. "You don't need that thing," Karen said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "People like you just want to feel special, like you have something wrong with you so the world has to accommodate you. But guess what? Life doesn't work like that. You don't get special privileges just because you think you're sick." Claire couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred at the edges, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. She had encountered ignorance before, had dealt with doctors who didn't believe her, coworkers who rolled their eyes when she had to stop to check her glucose levels, strangers who scoffed when they saw her using an insulin pump in public. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was cruelty for cruelty's sake. Claire started, but before she could get another word out, a police car rolled around the corner. Karen let out a soft scoff. "Oh, please." The officer parked in front of Claire's house, stepping out with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who had no real sense of urgency. He was middle-aged, with a thick mustache and the tired expression of a man who had probably been called out for one too many pointless neighbor disputes. His name tag read Harris. "You called about a theft?" he asked, looking between Claire and Karen with obvious disinterest. Claire stepped forward immediately. "Yes, my insulin pump was stolen. She took it," she said, pointing directly at Karen. "And she just admitted to throwing it away." Harris turned his attention to Karen, who folded her arms over her chest, tilting her head slightly as if she were the victim in all this. "Ma'am, is that true?" Harris asked. Karen sighed, as if this were all some massive inconvenience. "I didn't steal anything. I found a package sitting outside, and I disposed of it." "That's not theft." Claire's fists clenched. "It wasn't yours to dispose of." Harris raised a hand, signaling for her to lower her voice. "It was sitting unattended," Karen continued, her voice smooth and practiced. "I assumed it was abandoned. And honestly, officer, I didn't think it was appropriate for the neighborhood. It's not my fault if she leaves things lying around where anyone could take them." Claire felt a fresh wave of rage rising in her chest, but before she could speak, Harris turned back to her. "Do you have proof that the package was delivered?" "Yes," Claire snapped, pulling out her phone and showing him the delivery confirmation. "It was marked as delivered at exactly 2:37 p.m. I checked at 2:40, and it was already gone." Harris nodded slowly, jotting something down in his notepad. "Do you have proof that she took it?" Claire faltered. She knew what he was asking. Video footage, a photo, a witness. She had none of those things. I saw her, she said firmly. She admitted it to me. Harris turned back to Karen. Did you say that? Karen smirked. I said I disposed of an unattended package. That's not an admission of theft, officer. Claire's stomach twisted. Harris let out a long sigh, closing his notebook. Look, this sounds like a misunderstanding. Since the item is gone and there's no proof of intentional theft, there's not much I can do. Claire stared at him in disbelief. Are you kidding me? She took my medical device. She knew what it was. She threw it away on purpose. Harris gave her a look of vague sympathy, but his stance didn't change. Without proof, my hands are tied. I suggest you contact your insurance company and see about getting a replacement. Karen smiled, slow and victorious. Claire could barely breathe. Her insulin pump was gone. The police wouldn't help. And Karen had just made it clear this was far from over. Claire stood frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of her phone so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The officer's words echoed in her head, each syllable cutting through her like a serrated blade. Without proof, my hands are tied. It was absurd. The proof was standing right there in front of them, smirking like she had just won a game that Claire hadn't even realized she was playing. Every instinct in her body screamed that this wasn't over, that Karen had just made it very clear that she had no intention of stopping, and the absolute worst part was that she knew she could get away with it. Claire had watched too many people like her bend rules, twist narratives, manipulate systems in their favor. It was a game Karen had mastered, and now Claire was being dragged into it whether she wanted to be or not. She wanted to scream, wanted to demand that the officer do something, anything, but she could already see it in his face, the bored disinterest, the quiet condescension, the silent assumption that this was nothing more than a petty argument between neighbors. It didn't matter that the stolen item was a life-sustaining medical device. To him it was just another, she said, dispute over a package. He had already made up his mind that this wasn't worth his time, and nothing Claire said would change that. Karen knew it too. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with the cool detachment of someone who had done this before, someone who had learned exactly how to walk the line between malice and deniability. She wasn't an amateur. She had calculated every move, every word, every infuriatingly vague statement designed to let her slip through the cracks. The worst part was that it was working. Claire forced herself to take a breath, pushing down the overwhelming urge to scream. Anger wouldn't get her anywhere. If the police weren't going to help her, she needed to help herself. She could feel Karen's eyes on her, could hear the smug amusement in her voice when she finally broke the silence. See, sweetheart, you really should be more careful with your things. Can't just leave important stuff lying around. Claire's jaw clenched so hard it ached. She turned without another word, stalking back toward her house, her vision blurring at the edges as she forced herself to keep her breathing steady. She wouldn't let Karen see her break. She wouldn't give her the satisfaction. But the moment the door closed behind her, she collapsed against it, pressing her forehead against the cool wood as the reality of the situation settled into her bones like a sickness. Her insulin pump was gone. She couldn't get another one without going through an extensive process with her insurance company, one that would take weeks, maybe even months. And that was assuming they even approved the claim. Some policies only covered a new device every few years unless it was proven to be defective. Stolen? That was a gray area, one that would require mountains of paperwork, appeals, phone calls, and most likely an excruciating waiting period while they reviewed her case. She didn't have that kind of time. Her current pump was old, on its last legs, barely functioning as it was. It was only a matter of time before it failed completely, and when that happened, she wouldn't have a backup. She couldn't afford to wait. She needed a plan. The first step was contacting her insurance company. She spent the next hour navigating a seemingly endless labyrinth of automated menus and long hold times, only to be met with exactly the response she had dreaded. Because the theft hadn't resulted in an official police report because there was no proof, they couldn't immediately process her claim. She would need to submit a formal affidavit, provide additional documentation, and wait for an internal investigation before they could even consider approving a replacement. Claire hung up the phone, her hands shaking. Karen had stolen from her, had admitted to it, and yet she was the one being punished. That realization settled into her chest like a lead weight, but it wasn't just anger that took root this time. It was something colder, something sharper, something that refused to let her roll over and accept this as an inevitability. Fine. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. Claire spent the next day reaching out to legal contacts, anyone who might be able to help her navigate this nightmare. She had a lawyer not for anything like this, but for standard legal matters related to her divorce. He wasn't a criminal attorney, but he knew people, and that was enough for her to start. She explained the situation, laid out every detail, and within hours she had a new plan. Karen wanted to play games? Claire would play too. She filed a civil complaint, not just for the theft, but for harassment. She documented every interaction, every passive-aggressive remark, every instance of Karen interfering in her life. She included the stolen package, the police response, the impact it had on her ability to manage her medical condition. If law enforcement wasn't going to take it seriously, she would force them to acknowledge it another way. But she didn't stop there. Karen thrived on power, on the ability to manipulate people into submission. That power relied on fear, on the belief that no one would challenge her, that she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. Claire decided to strip her of that advantage. She started talking. Not just to her lawyer, not just to the insurance company, but to the people around her. The neighbors who had watched from behind their curtains, the ones who had avoided her gaze after the police left, the ones who had seemed just a little too hesitant when she had first asked if anyone had seen her package. She knocked on doors, started casual conversations, let details slip in the kind of offhanded way that made people feel comfortable enough to reciprocate. And it didn't take long before the stories started to come out. Karen had done this before. Not with medical devices, but with other things, packages that had gone missing, fines that had mysteriously appeared on people's records, complaints that had been filed against those who had crossed her in some way. She had connections, people who owed her favors, people who looked the other way when she decided to flex her control over the community. But the more Claire listened, the more she realized something important. People were afraid of Karen, but they were also tired of her. She wasn't untouchable. She had just convinced everyone she was. It was slow at first, but little by little, the momentum shifted. Other residents started coming forward, sharing their own experiences, offering to provide statements for Claire's case. It wasn't just about her anymore. Karen had made a habit of terrorizing people, and now for the first time, someone was pushing back. Claire didn't just want her insulin pump back anymore. She wanted Karen to pay. The first step had been gathering information. The next step was taking action, and she was just getting started. Claire had always considered herself a patient person. She had spent years perfecting the art of biting her tongue, of picking her battles, of letting things go for the sake of her own sanity. She had convinced herself that some fights just weren't worth it, that some people were immovable forces of nature, best avoided rather than confronted. But standing in her living room, surrounded by statements from neighbors, copies of complaints, and the absurd amount of paperwork her lawyer had already begun compiling, she realized something crucial. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. At first, it had been about getting her insulin pump back. That had been the priority, the most immediate concern, the thing that had sent her spiraling into action in the first place. But as the days passed, as the frustration mounted, as she uncovered more and more of what Karen had done, she understood that this had never just been about her. Karen had built an entire system of control, a structure designed to keep people too afraid, too exhausted, too demoralized to fight back. It wasn't just her missing medical device, it was the elderly couple down the street who had been fined for a rule that didn't exist. The single mother who had mysteriously lost her parking space after refusing to support one of Karen's proposals. The quiet man on the corner whose home had been vandalized after he had dared to argue against one of Karen's community improvement projects. Claire wasn't the first person Karen had tried to break, but she was going to be the last. Her lawyer had already warned her that this wouldn't be easy. Civil cases were slow, expensive, and exhausting. Proving Karen had stolen the package wouldn't be as simple as presenting the police report, especially when the officer had so clearly dismissed her concerns. But the harassment case? That had teeth, that had witnesses, that had a pattern. Karen had spent years making enemies, and Claire was beginning to realize just how many people were waiting for someone to give them permission to push back. She had expected Karen to sense the shift in the air. She had assumed that once she started making waves, once people began to whisper, once complaints started piling up, Karen would get nervous. Maybe she would back off, maybe she would find a way to return the stolen pump under the guise of a misunderstanding, maybe she would attempt some kind of hollow apology. But Karen didn't back off. She doubled down. It started with the fines. Claire came home one evening to find a notice taped to her front door, an official-looking document citing her for various violations. The paint on her house was apparently not up to code, despite the fact that she had checked the regulations before moving in. Her recycling bin had been placed in the wrong location, despite being exactly where it had been since she arrived. The small flower she had planted near her front step was deemed disruptive to community aesthetics, despite the fact that Karen herself had flower beds twice the size. She knew exactly what this was. She crumpled the notice in her fist, barely resisting the urge to throw it onto the pavement. The next morning, her lawyer advised her not to pay a cent. "This is a power play," he said. "She wants you to fold. She wants to make this miserable enough that you walk away." Claire wasn't walking away. The fines were just the beginning. A few days later, someone left a pile of garbage on her front lawn: old newspapers, torn plastic bags, empty cans. At first, she thought it was just an accident, some wind-blown mess from another property. But when she went to clean it up, she found a note buried underneath the trash. "You don't belong here." She stared at the words, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. She called the police again, not expecting much but needing the incident documented. The officer who arrived was younger than the first one, more attentive, more willing to listen, but ultimately he could only offer the same answer. "Without proof of who left it, there's not much we can do." She understood that. She didn't blame him for the system he was forced to work within. But it didn't change the fact that Karen had found another way to remind her that this was a war she wasn't meant to win. What Karen hadn't accounted for was the fact that Claire wasn't fighting alone anymore. The statements kept coming. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak started sending emails, letters, text messages detailing their own experiences. Claire compiled everything, forwarded it to her lawyer, watched as the case against Karen grew stronger by the day. But the real shift came when she received a message from someone unexpected. It was an email from a former member of the community board, someone who had once worked closely with Karen, someone who had been pushed out under suspicious circumstances. The message was brief, vague, but the implication was clear. "I know what she's done. I can help you." Claire stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She arranged to meet the man James Holloway at a quiet cafe just outside of town. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with the weary expression of someone who had spent far too long watching corruption fester. He wasted no time with pleasantries. "She's been doing this for years," he said. "Most people don't fight back. Most people don't have the energy. You're the first one who's actually making her nervous." That caught Claire's attention. "She doesn't seem nervous." James let out a humorless chuckle. "That's because she's good at pretending. But trust me, she's scrambling." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, internal communications from years ago, notes about meetings, decisions that had been made without proper approval, the evidence of Karen manipulating the system to serve her own interests. But there was one piece of paper that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. It was a record of a similar incident from years ago, a missing package, a stolen medical device, an insurance claim that had mysteriously been denied after a complaint had been filed. Karen had done this before, and she had gotten away with it. Claire looked up at James, feeling a fire ignite in her chest. "I want everything you have," she said. James nodded. "Then let's take her down." She walked out of that cafe with more than just information. She walked out with a plan. Karen had spent years believing she was untouchable. She was about to learn how wrong she was. Claire had expected Karen to retaliate. She wasn't naive enough to believe that pushing back would go unnoticed, and she certainly wasn't foolish enough to assume that Karen would simply roll over and accept defeat. But what she hadn't anticipated was just how far Karen was willing to go, how deeply she would dig her claws into the fabric of the neighborhood, how much destruction she was willing to cause just to prove a point. The first wave of attacks had been predictable fines, complaints, anonymous messages meant to unsettle her, but as soon as Claire started making real progress, as soon as she had proof, as soon as she had allies, Karen escalated. It started with her car. Claire walked outside one morning to find the windshield shattered, a thick spiderweb of cracks radiating out from a single point of impact. The glass hadn't completely caved in, but it was close, the edges of the damage glistening in the early morning light like jagged ice. She stared at it for a long moment, her brain struggling to process the reality of what she was seeing before her body caught up and she was moving, checking the doors, looking for any sign of forced entry. Nothing was missing, nothing else was damaged, just the windshield, just enough to be a problem, just enough to send a message. She didn't bother calling the police this time. She knew how that would go. Instead, she took pictures, sent them to her lawyer, and scheduled an immediate replacement. Karen wanted her rattled. She wanted her afraid. She wanted her to feel like no matter what she did, no matter how hard she fought, she would always be one step behind. Claire refused to give her that satisfaction, but Karen wasn't done. The next night, Claire woke to the sound of knocking, slow, deliberate, just loud enough to pull her from the depths of sleep but not enough to be considered aggressive. She sat up, heart hammering, straining to hear, but by the time she reached the door, whoever had been there was gone. She found another note the next morning. "You should drop this." Claire stared at the words, at the neat, precise handwriting, at the weight of the implied threat beneath the seemingly simple message. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. Karen was growing desperate. Her lawyer advised her to document everything, to stay cautious but not to engage, but Claire could feel the tension growing in her chest, a suffocating weight pressing against her ribs. This was beyond fines and vandalism now. This was personal. And then the lawsuit hit. Not her lawsuit, the one she had been preparing, the one she had spent weeks gathering evidence for, but one filed against her. A defamation suit, claiming that Claire had been spreading false information, harassing members of the community, and deliberately attempting to undermine the leadership in place. It was a joke, a transparent attempt to paint herself as the victim, but it was a move that forced Claire onto the defensive. Legal battles weren't quick. They weren't cheap. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. But she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated Claire's resolve. Instead of panicking, instead of retreating, Claire doubled down. She met with her lawyer, countered every point, filed her own suit with the new evidence James had provided, and began reaching out beyond the neighborhood. If Karen wanted to play games, Claire would make sure she was playing against an opponent who knew how to win. The local news station had ignored her the first time she reached out, but now, with the lawsuit, with tangible proof of Karen's long history of manipulation, they were interested. They sent a reporter to speak with her, to interview other residents, to piece together the bigger picture of what had been happening for years. Karen had thrived in the shadows behind closed doors where fear and silence kept people from standing against her. Claire was going to drag her into the light, and Karen knew it. The night before the story was set to air, Claire came home to find her backyard gate wide open. She never left it that way. Her stomach tightened as she stepped inside, every nerve on edge, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. The house was undisturbed, the locks still in place, but when she checked her kitchen, she froze. Her insulin vials, her backup supply were gone. Every single one. Her chest tightened, panic clawing at her throat. Because this wasn't just an inconvenience. This wasn't just a financial hit, this was an attack on her ability to survive. She scrambled through her cabinets, checking every place she kept her supplies, but it was all gone. Every last vial, every last emergency dose. She had never felt fear like this before. The thought of calling the police flashed through her mind, but she already knew how that would go. Without proof, without evidence, without security footage, they would do nothing. They would tell her to file a report. They would tell her to contact her pharmacy. They would tell her there was nothing they could do. So she called James instead. "I need you to get me everything you have," she said the moment he answered. "Now." There was a pause. "Then, Claire, what happened?" "Karen just tried to kill me." And maybe that was an exaggeration, maybe she wasn't in immediate danger, maybe there were still ways to replace her insulin before she ran out completely, but in that moment, it felt true. Because Karen had crossed a line that could not be ignored, a line that turned this from a fight about power into something much darker. James didn't hesitate. "Meet me in an hour." She drove faster than she should have, hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. By the time she arrived at the meeting spot, a small, nearly empty diner on the edge of town, James was already there, a thick file sitting in front of him. He slid it across the table without a word. Inside were bank records, email exchanges, receipts, proof that Karen had been using her position for personal gain, funneling money through fake projects, pushing out homeowners who didn't comply, profiting off of every deal. It was more than Claire had expected, more than enough to bring her down. But there was one document that caught Claire's eye, one that sent a fresh wave of rage burning through her veins. A list of names, people Karen had targeted, and at the top of that list, her own. She swallowed hard, looking up at James. "How long has she been planning this?" His expression was grim. "Before you even moved in." Claire exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. This wasn't just a battle of wills. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute. This was a war Karen had been waging long before Claire even knew her name. And now it was about to end. She closed the file, met James's gaze, and nodded. "Let's finish this." Claire had spent weeks preparing for this moment, collecting every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every financial discrepancy that pointed to Karen's abuse of power. She knew that today would be the turning point, the moment where Karen would either crumble under the weight of her own corruption or fight tooth and nail to maintain the illusion of control she had spent years cultivating. The morning of the hearing, Claire woke up early, nerves humming under her skin. But as soon as she stepped outside, she knew Karen had made one last desperate move. The locks on her front door had been jammed with adhesive, the key refusing to turn, the door refusing to budge no matter how much force she applied. It was childish, petty, exactly the kind of sabotage Claire had come to expect, and instead of frustration, all she felt was confirmation that Karen was scared. She didn't hesitate. She climbed through the side window, grabbed her car keys, and drove to the courthouse, unshaken and more determined than ever. When she arrived, Karen was already there, dressed immaculately as always, standing tall, chin lifted, a picture of forced confidence. But Claire saw the cracks forming. The tight grip on the folder in her hands, the way her gaze flicked around the room, the way she kept pressing her lips together like she was trying to suppress something. She knew this wasn't just another minor inconvenience, another situation she could manipulate and twist in her favor. This was the moment where everything fell apart. The courtroom was small, the kind of space meant for minor disputes, parking violations, noise complaints, not for the dismantling of a woman who had spent years bending the system to serve her own interests. Claire's lawyer presented their case with ruthless precision, laying out every fraudulent fine, every falsified complaint, every neighbor who had been bullied or threatened into compliance. Witness statements piled up, each one reinforcing the last, painting Karen not as a dedicated community leader but as a tyrant, someone who had weaponized bureaucracy for personal gain. Karen, of course, played her role flawlessly at first. She gasped at the accusations, clutched at her chest as though personally wounded by the lies being spread about her. She wept, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling as she claimed she had only ever acted in the best interest of the neighborhood. But for every excuse she tried to make, there was a counter. Documents, testimonies, emails, proof that this wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't a one-time mistake, but a calculated pattern of abuse. Then came the final blow. James had come through in a way Claire hadn't expected. He had managed to dig up an old settlement, a lawsuit Karen had quietly settled years ago, to avoid an official record. Another homeowner, pushed out through the same methods: fraudulent fines, threats, harassment. The wording of the complaints, the tactics used, the fabricated violations, it was all identical. The judge's expression hardened as they flipped through the pages, their tone shifting from impartial to something far sharper. This wasn't just a case of one disgruntled homeowner seeking revenge. This was systemic. This was corruption. And Karen had finally been caught. For the first time since this had all started, Karen was speechless. The ruling came swiftly. The defamation suit Karen had filed against Claire was dismissed immediately, deemed frivolous and retaliatory. The judge ordered a full investigation into the financial records, the fines, the handling of community funds, and in the meantime, Karen was stripped of any authority within the neighborhood. Effective immediately, she was no longer in charge of anything. She had lost. Completely. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat quietly. As soon as the hearing adjourned, as soon as the final words left the judge's mouth, she turned to Claire with a venomous glare, her composure cracking like fragile glass. "This isn't over," she hissed, voice low enough that only Claire could hear. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started." Claire didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait, didn't give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She just looked at her, calm, unwavering, and then turned and walked away, because it was over. Karen just didn't know it yet. Claire didn't allow herself to relax until days had passed since the hearing, until the reality of Karen's downfall had fully settled, but until the neighborhood itself seemed to exhale in relief. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for weeks, the constant stress, the fear of what Karen might do next, it was gone. The official paperwork confirmed what she already knew. Karen had been stripped of any authority. All fines issued under her leadership were now under review, and a full audit of the community's financial records was underway. The investigation into her misconduct was no longer Claire's burden to carry, no longer her battle to fight. The system had finally turned its attention toward Karen, and now she was the one being held accountable, the one forced to prove her innocence against mounting evidence. The neighborhood, once silent in their fear of her retaliation, had turned against her completely. The people who had previously been too afraid to speak out were now emboldened, realizing that the reign of terror they had accepted as unshakable had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. They stopped averting their eyes when Claire walked past, stopped whispering about her as if she had somehow been the problem, stopped treating Karen's absence as something temporary. It was over. Karen herself had not gone quietly. In the days following the hearing, Claire had expected some desperate attempt at reasserting control, some last-ditch effort to regain her footing. But nothing she did had any weight anymore. She had sent out letters to the neighborhood, trying to rally support, trying to frame herself as the true victim, but no one cared. She had attempted to challenge the judge's decision, but the dismissal had been final. She had tried to intimidate Claire one last time, showing up uninvited, lingering at the edge of her property as if she was still capable of exerting dominance. But Claire had simply called the police. It was almost surreal watching Karen realize, in real time, that she no longer had power, that her threats were meaningless, that she was now nothing more than a bitter, disgraced woman whose influence had finally crumbled. The moment the police arrived and told Karen to leave, the moment she hesitated as if she couldn't comprehend that someone was actually telling her no, the moment she turned and walked away without another word, Claire knew she had won. Word spread fast that Karen had put her house on the market. It wasn't surprising. Without her position, without the power she had clung to for so long, there was nothing left for her here. She had spent years making enemies, and now, with no control left to wield, she couldn't bear to exist among the people who despised her. Claire saw the for sale sign go up in Karen's front yard a week later, and by the end of the month she was gone. There was no dramatic farewell, no final attempt at revenge, no lingering presence waiting to make a comeback. One day she was simply no longer there. The house sat empty for a while, a strange reminder of everything that had happened, but eventually new owners moved in, people who had no idea who Karen was, people who weren't haunted by the memories of her cruelty. Life moved on, as it always did. Claire's own life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after everything she had been through. Her stolen insulin pump had been replaced, fully covered by her insurance after the legal battle had solidified the theft beyond any reasonable doubt. The pharmacy had expedited the process, ensuring she wasn't left vulnerable any longer than necessary, and though the frustration of it all still lingered, she knew she had come out stronger on the other side. She had learned that fighting back wasn't always easy, that justice wasn't always immediate, but that some battles were worth every ounce of effort, no matter how exhausting. She had learned that silence only ever benefited the people who thrived on fear, that standing alone was often just an illusion, that even in the face of overwhelming opposition, there were always people willing to push back if given the chance. The neighborhood, once fractured under Karen's rule, began to heal. People who had barely spoken before started gathering, started rebuilding the sense of community that had been lost under her reign. The new leadership worked to reverse the damage she had done, to undo the unnecessary regulations, to bring transparency to decisions that had once been made behind closed doors. It wasn't perfect, and Claire doubted any neighborhood ever was, but it was better. One evening, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, enjoying the kind of quiet that no longer felt suffocating, she noticed an older woman, Mrs. Peterson, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, walking by with her dog. She hesitated for a moment before stopping at the edge of Claire's yard, her expression unreadable. "You did a good thing," she finally said. Claire smiled, nodding in quiet acknowledgement because she knew it was true. It had been hard. It had been exhausting. It had pushed her to her absolute limits, but it had been worth it. Karen was gone. The fear she had cultivated was gone. And for the first time since moving here, Claire finally felt like she was home,